Why did they lower the property qualifications for voting for the people who would populate the conventions?
I think there were some theoretical reasons and some practical reasons. The Constitution is proposing a dramatic change in the existing rules, and it's not going to work unless somehow it's specially legitimated. All sorts of people whose goodwill you need to make the new system work, in effect say, yes, we agreed to that. The Constitution is in some ways going against the existing power structure, which is controlled by state governments. It's draining power away from existing state governments. And so the only way you're going to actually have that system actually work and get state governments to surrender power, these people who are in place in the 13 states, to surrender power, is to appeal to some sort of higher authority. So to outflank them.
Let me ask you this. You don't mention this, but I can't help wondering whether it's anywhere from relevant to of the essence. We had Gary Nash here recently on this program, a historian from UCLA who's written about the period 1763 to 1790. And one thing that I didn't realize is the extent to which in the 1760s and 1770s, and even on into the 1780s, what they called crowd action played a major role in the political life of the United States. Crowd action is a phrase that comes from old Britain, where people would riot in the streets. You'd have mobs running through the streets.
The people out of doors.
People out of doors, thank you. And that they were pulling down houses here in the colonies. Is that my question is that possibly a reason why the people who framed the Constitution felt you had to get everybody on your side, which they then did by letting everybody vote for who would sit in the conventions, because if you don't, you might get crowd actions?
My favorite historian on this issue is Pauline Maier, who actually is here in Boston at MIT, who writes a wonderful book about the role of people power in the American Revolutionary era. Her book is from resistance to revolution. And even England has certain traditions of mob action, of popular action. And these traditions are even more powerful, far more powerful in the colonies, because you don't have as much of an aristocracy in the colonies. You don't have the monarchy has much more power in England than here in America. There's not a strong established church in America the way there is in England. And some of the official government structures, like Parliament, well, Americans aren't even voting for Parliament, and so they don't quite have legitimacy. So what organizations do have legitimacy in America? Stuff that ordinary Americans can participate in: the militia, the jury, the hue and cry, the posse, the grand jury, and these things kind of, and then the local legislatures, connect to the people acting out of doors. So here's a connected point.
So wait, before you go to connected point, let me see if I can summarize this to say in a way that I understand. What you're saying is one of the reasons they had lesser property qualifications to vote for delegates to the ratification conventions is that there were a whole series of things, of ways by which the common people could make their views felt, ranging from crowd actions to juries to grand juries to whatever. And so they knew that they had to get all these people on board.
On board. And don't forget militias. That's what I was going to add. The American Revolution fundamentally sort of redefines issues of inclusion, exclusion. Under the colonies, the rules were who had property and who didn't. When the American Revolution comes along, that's not the dividing line. The dividing line is, are you a patriot or are you a Tory, someone who's loyal to the crown? And if you're a patriot, even if you don't meet the ordinary property qualifications, if you're part of the American militia, if you're willing to fight and put your body and your life on the line, you should be part of the political structure. So in 1776, Pennsylvania adopts a new constitution, and again, my friend Pauline Maier has written quite brilliantly on this. In 1776, Pennsylvania adopts a constitution in which militiamen who were on the patriot side were allowed to vote and allowed to participate even if they didn't meet the ordinary property qualifications. The real issue was, are you a loyal American? And that's going to be a theme Later in American history, blacks help win the Civil War, then they get the vote. Women are part of World War I, then the World War I effort, they get the vote. 18-year-olds are fighting and dying in Vietnam, and they get the vote. So
let me
national security connected to democracy.
Now let me bring up two things. We'll get to slavery. That was your second point, but I want to pursue what you've been talking about. In terms of blacks, well, they thought things would get better for them because they fought in the Revolution. They thought the same in 1812, I believe. Certainly they felt the same in 1898. They felt the same in 1917. They felt the same in the 1940s. It never happened until the 1960s. So this business about being in a militia, I mean, it was true for everybody but for the African Americans. Would that be a fair statement of the situation?
Well, it's a partial statement, okay. And it's fair insofar as you go, but let me add a few elements on the other side. Sure. So the Constitution originally was, I think, pro-slavery in some ways, and we can talk about that. The biggest pro-slavery dimension is the 3/5 clause.
Yeah, no, don't get into that yet.
Okay.
We'll get a whole.
But it wasn't. But it wasn't anti-black. It wasn't about. It did not endorse race distinctions among free people. Yeah. So free blacks fought in the American Revolution, and they voted on the Constitution itself. Slaves didn't. They were excluded, but free blacks were part of the founding story. So let's distinguish between slavery and just race discrimination among free people. Now, after the Civil War, the Constitution at least is formally changed, and it says blacks have to be allowed to vote equally. That wasn't in the original Constitution, but it did get changed. It didn't fully happen on the ground. That 15th Amendment didn't fully get implemented until almost 100 years later. But the Constitution at least was changed to say blacks are supposed to be allowed to do it. And for the next 100 years, when blacks are excluded from voting, it's in violation of the Constitution rather than consistent with it. Whereas it was okay under the Constitution to do that prior to the Civil War.
Yeah, then we just decided we didn't comment or Vander about the law. What do I care about the law? I got the power, ain't I?
Right, they weren't actually enforcing the Constitution.
You make the point that at the time of the Revolution and the writing of the Constitution, in that 1776 to 1789 period, you had the juries, the militia, the grand juries. People were allowed to vote for the delegates to the ratification conventions. You had the people out of doors, which for the public meant the people who were not in the legislative halls. They were outside the doors, the people out of doors. How do you compare that in spirit and in fact with the situation that we have today in the United States?
Well, ours remains a system where there's just lots of things that go on outside the legislature, lots of lobbying and petitioning. Ours is still, I think, formally a free and robust system. There are a lot of places around the world where people can't speak out against the government and act out. Our system still has juries to some extent, but it may very well be that some Americans today are just a lot more inert than we should be.
Let me